Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 30th of October. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by CEC producer and researcher Glen Isherwood. Now, Glen, you're normally on the other side of the camera, so welcome to our side.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, supporting Obama's madness in the South China Sea is choosing war. And British Crown establishment turns on the victims to protect high-level paedophiles. But Glenn, first, before we begin that, we want to pay tribute to a rather extraordinary individual who passed away this last week, who is a British politician, the Labor Member of Parliament, Michael Meacher, who you and I both had the benefit of meeting a number of times. Now, it might seem a bit unusual for an Australian TV show to do this, but Michael Meacher, one of the reasons we're doing it, and we want to bring him to Australia's attention, is there are close links between the Australian Labor Party and the UK Labor Party. And the CEC, we see ourselves in the tradition of the old Labor Party in Australia. And what we discovered when we've visited the UK is there are people in the UK Labor Party who are really in that same tradition of what we in Australia would call old Labor. But we don't find them in Australia anymore.
No, we unfortunately have had the takeover from the Hawke and Keating era and this consensus on economic policy, which is the free market and globalisation.
And they had it, and they had the same thing in the UK. That's what Tony Blair represented. But there's a greater resistance to that all along in the Labor Party over there. And this gentleman, Michael Meacher, led that resistance for many years. He was a Member of Parliament for 40 years. He actually first campaigned for Parliament 49 years ago, and he died suddenly this week, and it's a really great loss. He was a minister for a long time in various Labor governments in the UK. He fought Thatcher really hard. He fought the deindustrialisation of the United Kingdom economy that Thatcher caused through things like the Big Bang in the City of London. Michael Meacher fought all that.
And the campaign that he really took up in these last recent years that we were collaborating with Michael on personally was the fight to re-establish Glass-Steagall.
Exactly.
And he saw our role, the CEC's role in Australia, as being unique. He's saying that Australians have a responsibility because we're not encumbered by the establishment and by this crusty old, fixed in their ways class who want to run things from on high. We can take the initiative to implement things like Glass-Steagall. So he found a joy in working with us on that. And he gave an interview to Gabrielle Pewitt, one of our executive members, that you filmed, of course. You produced that interview for the CEC's March 2015 International Conference. And in that interview, he expressed what you're saying, and he also expressed his support with us on issues like opposing the expansion of NATO, as a targeting of Russia, which is leading the world to war. I just have a little anecdote for my first meeting with Michael, which is, it was last year, and I took along to him as a gift Malcolm Fraser's book, Dangerous Allies. And of course, Malcolm Fraser was a Conservative Member of Parliament in Australia, a Liberal, and a Prime Minister. I'm sure Michael was familiar with Malcolm Fraser.
Well, and in the book, Fraser was expressing, ideas that I knew Meacher would support. And when I gave him the book, Meacher said, he had a double take, and he said, "What do I want that for?" I said, "Do you know who he is?" He said, "Of course I know who he is." And he was really intrigued that here's someone that an ideological class warrior from the days of yore. These two guys in their latter years came to see things in a very similar way.
And I'll just say that for those who want to really get a picture of Michael Meacher's legacy and his ideas, there's a book he wrote called The State We Need, Keys to the Renaissance of Britain, which champions, among other things, a credit system to rebuild the manufacturing base of Britain.
And Glenn, in this week's CEC Report, we're going to be promoting our Australian Alert Service a lot. But that is also included in this week's edition. People can call in and get a copy of a book review a 2-page book review that we did on that, which also includes a tribute to Michael in this week's edition. And we'll be inviting people to call in for that later on as well. But let's move on. We want to start off with the South China Sea, Glenn, just quickly, and then we're going to get onto our feature today, which is on the UK paedophile scandal. But we have to talk about the South China Sea because this is a burning fuse to war. And what we're saying is supporting Obama's madness in the South China Sea is choosing war. So on the 27th of October, Barack Obama ordered his Navy, the US Navy, to make an incursion inside the 12 nautical mile exclusion zone that China insists on around these islands. And these are islands, these are coral reefs that they've built up into islands, right? So everyone knows those particulars. Now, we do know, Glenn, we've got inside information from the US that the US military is not, fully signed up to Obama's agenda on this. So the US Navy at least notified the Chinese in advance they were going to do it, and they kept the incursion to a minimum, but it's a symbolic thing more than anything, and it's very, very damaging. And the Chinese have warned completely emphatically that they will respond to this type of provocation. They're not going to tolerate it. An important thing to know is the current United States Defense Secretary, Ashton Carter, is not a military thinker. He's one of these RAND Corporation type analysts. And this is a sect that's taken over or largely infiltrated the US military over the last 40, 50 years. And they treat war as a mathematical calculation. And these idiots will calculate the world into a nuclear war, the kind of thing that's sort of ridiculed in the movie Dr. Strangelove. That's what this guy has.
The type of people that John F. Kennedy had the measure of and was countering
exactly.
inside his own cabinet.
Exactly. So the last 3 US defense secretaries have been people that are much more military in their thinking. This guy is much more of this, mathematical analyst type. Mm-hmm. And so they see this guy, they just say this is a part of their calculation, which can quickly spiral out of control. The part we want to address, though, is this. The insanity, the worst part of the insanity is our support. Mm. Our government has expressed this week that we are all the way with Obama on this, all the way. And that's particularly insane, given that even Americans are not all the way with him on it.
And here's the problem, Robbie, with the whole point is you have this two-faced duplicity from Australia and from the United States with China. It was just only a few weeks ago that Xi Jinping was in Washington and he was being praised. They were talking about having cooperation between the US and China.
Special relationship, etc.
And then you have this, about face from Obama and from Australia where we're all the way with Obama in these military provocations that are going on. And here's the irony is Australia, our biggest trading partner is China. And all of that trade is going through the South China Sea. I mean, 23% of our trade with our foreign trade is Chinese with the Chinese. It's going through those waters. China has an interest in keeping that area peaceful because it's one of the major hubs of trade in the world. So any destabilization of that region is a destabilization of China. And I think, Obama understands that these neocon war hawks, they understand it and they're using it to provoke China, which is going to drive us into World War III.
Exactly. And like you said, just to emphasise the point for Australians, we're told that reason we're supporting America is our interest as Australia is in the freedom of navigation of those waters for the sake of our trade. And that's just an insane thing to say because our trade is with China, right? Yeah. China is not a threat to its own trade with Australia. So we have to, again, let's cite Malcolm Fraser. He was very critical of American and Australian policy on this just before he died. A lot of people around the world are. This is an insane calculation. As Australians, we need to not drag into the sophistic arguments and actually make sure that we force our government to not go along with this insanity that would lead to war.
Yeah, and Robbie, I'll just add that we have in the CEC for many years opposed this entire Asia pivot policy. The troops being stationed in Darwin, we've put out many new citizens exposing that we, as part of the Five Eyes military alliance, are providing the support to Obama's drone strikes and provocations against Russia and China, and we must step out of that role. We must be a sovereign country. And I mean, those who are watching who believe that Australia needs to be a sovereign country need to join the CEC.
All right, well, Glenn, thanks for that. Let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll discuss our feature on the British Crown protecting paedophiles. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So this week's feature is British Crown establishment turns on the victims to protect high-level paedophiles. And what we want to do is bring your attention to a feature that is the main feature of this week's Australian Alert Service. So like I said in the last segment, you can call in and get your own copy of this, and we urge you to do it because we're not going to do justice in our discussion to it today. There's lots of details there, including a very important interview people should read. But the feature is called BBC Covers for Crown Establishment Paedophiles Yet Again. And so we want to highlight it in its own right, but the other factor, Glenn, is Australia has its own issue, actually. There's a big Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in Australia, institutionalised child sexual abuse, which has been quite shocking in its own right. Just in the last little period, there's been some really explosive allegations aired from people like Senator Bill Heffernan and certain victims that this is even bigger in Australia than this Royal Commission reveals. So as shocking as that is, though, there is nothing that even comes into any comparison with what is being revealed in the United Kingdom over the last few years. And so what's prompted us to do this is on the 5th of October, the BBC's version of Four Corners, its Panorama program, did a show on the VIP pedophile scandal, What's the Truth? And that turned out to be a shameless attack on the victims and the people who've campaigned to expose this. So step the viewers through the elements that we know about there and the cover-up.
All right, the first thing that is most important to point out is that this is not something that's just been a recent scandal. This is a historic case of institutional child abuse going back well over 30 years.
And an actual ring, a coordinated ring at the highest levels of paedophiles.
And at the highest levels. So what's happened is there have been campaigners. In our alert, we interview Chris Fay, who's a campaigner and former social worker with children. And what they have been campaigning to is expose the fact that very high-level politicians who worked in Westminster and worked in Buckingham Palace and were intimate with the royals, with the Windsors, were pedophiles. And when whenever this was raised in the last 30 years, it was systematically covered up by those establishment groups like MI5, Special Branch. And this is what was, again, we saw with the BBC story. So what's happened is in 2012, this entertainer, eccentric figure, Jimmy Savile, was exposed as probably the most prolific British pedophile
you can
known.
imagine. It's
yeah, I mean, abusing thousands of children.
an absolute monster he's proved to be.
And what was shown was that many people came forward and wanted to expose him, but there was the sense that the establishment was protecting him, and they were. And so when he died, it all blew up. Now, the BBC was, back then, pulled stories. They shut down journalists.
Well, they were his employer for 40 years. That's part of it.
And abusing them at the BBC studios. He was using that premises. When they were going to run a story on Savile, the higher ups at BBC shut that story down and opted instead for tributes to Jimmy Savile. Now, this all came out. So that was in late 2011, 2012. Now, fast forward to 2015. As early as July of this year, there were rumours that BBC were preparing a story to debunk the claims of a VIP pedophile ring. And who did they target? They targeted Chris Fay, who is the key campaigner who works very closely with other victims, and another campaigner, Bill Maloney. There was their second target was Tom Watson, who's an outspoken MP and happens to be the deputy leader of the Labor Party under Jeremy Corbyn.
And it also happens to be the guy who, more than any other in the British Parliament, took on Rupert Murdoch.
Yes. So they've gone after Tom Watson and specifically him for naming Leon Britton. Now, it's important to know that Leon Britton is the former Home Secretary under Margaret Thatcher. He was, as the leader of the, as Home Secretary, he oversaw MI5 and oversaw Special Branch in those key years of the 1980s, which is where a lot of these cover-ups started to occur.
So the first allegations about Britton was that he was the central figure in the cover-ups, but then more has come out since then.
Yes, and Chris Fay and others have accused, have had evidence taken by Special Branch and taken by the police that point to Leon Britton being involved in attending a place called Elm Guest House, which was in London. And at this Elm Guest House is where paedophiles would go. It was a gay brothel. They recorded child pornography there. They kept the owner of it kept a logbook, and that logbook was disappeared. And a lot of the evidence about Elm Guest House has been disappeared. And so what the BBC set out to do is say that it's not credible, and all these people who have come forward are not credible. And so what is seen here is a pattern that the BBC is closing in to protect Leon Britton. And that's a critical point, because Leon Britton is central to the whole 30-year period of this scandal.
Now, in our alert service, we do a very detailed interview with the campaigner, Chris Fay, which is an excellent interview, really. People need to watch it, where he goes through the details. And he's the guy who, from the beginning, exposed the names of people associated with this, and you can see how the scandal unfolded in his own words. And if you ever get to watch the Panorama program, you can see why this is such an unjust attack. Let's take a break, because when we come back for the final segment, we're going to talk about why this cover-up was able to be pulled off so comprehensively until now, because it relates to the power of one institution, the Crown.
Yes.
Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing as our main feature the British establishment paedophile scandal in the United Kingdom. So before the break, Glenn, you went through the elements of it. But now let's talk about the cover-up, because the cover-up is pretty well known now. But the thing that we want to highlight and need to highlight, because this part is relevant to Australia as well, that it is obvious that the cover-up was only able to happen in as comprehensively as it did because of the power of the Crown.
Yes.
So just go through the specific connections between this child abuse scandal and the royal family itself.
Well, let's just have a look at the connections between those named as pedophiles and the Crown. So, as this scandal has emerged, this Elm Guest House had a logbook, as we mentioned in the last segment, and some of those key attendees to this guest house were members that were inside Buckingham Palace. The most notable one was, first of all, Sir Anthony Blunt, who was the keeper of the Queen's pictures and was outed as a spy for the Soviets, but nevertheless was kept on as a key figure in Buckingham Palace.
And he's the cousin of the Queen Mum, and of course this MI6 agent, famous MI6 agent.
Yeah. The next is Michael Trestrail, and he was the Royal Protection Squad, the leader of that. And he stepped down from that position after it was revealed he'd been with several gay prostitutes.
And someone understood to be very personally close,
very close.
A first name basis with the Queen,
yeah,
I
she would
believe.
wrap blankets around the Queen when she got cold. And another one was Richard Langley, who was an aide to the Queen and to Buckingham Palace. So that's one aspect. They're all named as visitors to Elm Guest House. Then you have the MI6 connections, which again at the highest levels, Sir Peter Hayman, who was a diplomat, he was exposed carrying child pornography all over the place. Now, coming back to Savile, Jimmy Savile, the most notorious of these figures.
This monster who had a reign of terror for 40 years, what are his connections?
Well, his connections to Buckingham Palace were huge, and he was very intimate with them, and so much so that he gave explicit direction to any friends of his not to talk about it. Now, Jimmy Savile was introduced into the high establishment layers by none other than Louis Mountbatten.
Lord Louis?
Lord Louis Mountbatten, and he called him Lord Louis. And Lord Louis is named by one of the victims that came forward on 60 Minutes as being a paedophile who attended and frequented another location where this went on, Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast.
Yeah, the 60 Minutes story on this in July that Australia's 60 Minutes did, Glenn, was actually a very good story. And this particular victim was on that.
And just to come back, on that point, the BBC also attacked the news agency Xaro News, who contributed to the 60 Minutes story. But Lord Louis Mountbatten was the great favourite uncle to Prince Charles. As Savile recounted in one of his biographies to a friend, it was Lord Louis Mountbatten who gave him the platform by which to become close to Charles and become close to the whole Windsor family. And so you have all these cases where not only MI5, Special Branch and Leon Britton are implicated, but then you have the secret world of the Windsors where you have Jimmy Savile as well.
And that relationship between Savile and Charles was a 40-year relationship. It was very intimate. He wasn't just a friend, he was an advisor to Charles on relationships and other things. But apart from that, there's Mountbatten himself though, as you've said. But so in terms of the cover-up though, Glenn, here you have an institution, there's reason for a cover-up, obviously, it's quite obvious. There's the Crown itself that has all these connections. But in terms of the agencies for the cover-up, like this latest BBC thing, the Crown has an involvement in that as well, because it gets to choose who runs the BBC.
That's
right?
correct. And the leader of the BBC Trust is Lady Rona Fairhead, Commander of the British Empire. She was chosen, and all the leaders of the BBC, many establishment figures, you just have a look at their titles and knighthoods and whatnot, but they are all approved by the Crown.
All right, let's try. I want to finish with a quote here by Chris Fay in our interview, but people can get the copy and read it themselves. This is what he says. These things become apparent to me and a lot of other people, especially with this current government, these posh toffs, their right to be public school educated, which means elite private schools, their right to go to Oxford, their entitlement to do everything, jobs, you name it, and the fact that they can do anything they like, and the rest of the establishment just closes around them and covers up for them no matter what. And then he goes, and that is still the policy, to be part of the establishment with our unwritten constitution. They just make the law and the rules as they go along. And then he goes on to talk about the Privy Council itself, answering directly to the Queen, being the agency through which this is done. And of course the Privy Council.
Most importantly, this is why you need to have a constitution and a republic to hold this power in check.
Which is what Chris Fay actually says. So, all right, like I said, we haven't done justice to it. You've got to read this. Call in to get a free copy. But that's it, Glenn. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's edition of the CEC Report.